G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous idea for you. The best way to transcend our differences and come together as humans is through art. That doesn't really sound like a very dangerous idea, actually. It sounds almost like a cliche. Maybe that's the dangerous idea. Is it merely a cliche that art can bring people together, or is there a common empathy that art can foster that is basically crucial to the flourishing of humankind? Emile Sherman thinks so. He's an Australian film and television producer. He's been on the show before, one of the few goats who is able to come back onto this illustrious program because he has a new podcast called The Sandbox, where he takes... So let me give you a little bit of background about him. So he is the managing director of this Australian and British production company and won an Academy Award for The King's Speech. He won a BAFTA for Best Film, Best British Film. He won a BAFTA for Top of the Lake, a television show. He was nominated for an Emmy for that. He won a nominated for a Golden Globe for that, for a BAFTA as well. The last time he was on the show, it was fascinating because it was not that long after Will Smith did the slap. Remember the slap at the Academy Awards? And Emile was there. So we went into some detail about that. That's an episode worth digging out and finding and listening to. So I don't go into great detail in this episode about what it's like to be at the Oscars and like what it feels like to win an Academy Award, but we do go into all of that and, you know, how you even prepare an Academy Award acceptance speech and so on the last time that Emile was on the show. So what he's doing now is he's got this podcast called The Sandbox, where he takes the creatives who have created some of the biggest television shows and movies that he's produced, and he sits down with them and he talks about their creative process. So there's an episode with the creator of One Life, which was this Anthony Hopkins film about the guy who saved 700 Jewish refugees during World War II, the creators of The Royal Hotel, of Lion, the movie with Nicole Kidman and Dev Patel, of Slow Horses, another one of Emile's production company's television shows, Heartstopper, Sweet Pea, all these amazing TV shows and movies, to try to find what is the common thread between people who create some of the most compelling and captivating art that we currently consume. And here, I wanted to talk to Emile about what his insights are working with creatives at the moment in the, I suppose, cultural moment we find ourselves in, why it is that creatives can sometimes seem to lack a certain breadth of intellectual imagination when it comes to their political activism and when it comes to how sort of narrowly defined their social justice motivations can seem to be. We talk about whether artificial intelligence is ever going to be creative. We go all over the place. I mean, it's just such a delight to sit down with someone as brainy and as successful and as creative as Emile, who has been able to bridge these two worlds of business success and also enormous creative output. If you are a free subscriber, this will be a shorter preview of the longer conversation. The full conversation is an hour and a half plus, and it goes all over the place. It's well worth subscribing for at uncomfortableconversations.substack.com and getting your own private feed. Another reminder that if you haven't bought tickets to see Coleman Hughes and me in Melbourne on the 28th of August, race to your nearest smartphone to do so. You can find links in the description to this episode. Please enjoy as much as I did the one, the only, Emile Sherman. Yeah, well, thanks for coming back.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
So, creatives and like open-mindedness and intellect, and what kind of insight into humankind creatives have is what I'm interested in picking your brain about today. You've got a new podcast, which is
The Sandbox.
The
Sandbox comes from my company Seesaw Films, which is a TV film production company based here in Australia and the UK. And we wanted to, we realized we're working with such incredible creatives, and often we're like just in the doing all the time. But to have a podcast which steps back a second and explores a little more philosophically and interestingly what creativity is and what it means to these incredible people that we work with every day. And particularly I'm interested in creativity under pressure. This is not just a visual artist taking as long as they need to create a painting, or a novelist working in isolation. We need the script by Wednesday, 4 p.m. because we shoot on Thursday.
Yeah.
How do you be creative with the intensity of that time pressure? When you're shooting a show, the creativity and time pressure needed every day to get these actors to play and to find truth. And at the same time, if you go 5 minutes overtime, that's going to cost us $10,000.
Yeah.
Those are incredibly opposing forces.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. There's like pure creativity, then there's creativity under pressure, but then there's also what you do, which baffles me as well, which is being able to pick who's going to be good at creativity under pressure. Like, you have to be both creative and also a hard-nosed business person who has a good eye for who is going to be for A, what kind of creativity is going to work and what is there a market for, and B, what is actually going to function when the rubber meets the road, and it's not going to be some pie in the sky, airy-fairy creative who ends up wandering off and, submitting half a draft.
That's right. I mean, you have to be creative as well as you have to be able to work in teams a lot in our business. You've got to be able to work to deadline.
So what are you looking for? What gives you the ability to pick it?
Well, I think, more than all of that, it's actually as a creative business, leader or, having my own creative business, it's about creating an organization where creativity can flourish. That's how I think of the problem we're trying to solve. How do we support creativity and, provide a structure and a context and a group of people, and choosing a right group of people who can bring out the best in the creatives we work with, and also having a lot of amazing creative people in our company at Seesaw, whether it be the producers, development team, and whatever. So,
and do you do development in-house, or any of your big hits, have they come from inside the walls of the building, which you guys
they're all
have come
developed
up with?
In-house. I mean, there's
but I mean the original conceit of the idea.
Oh, the original conceit. Yes, some of them come internally. Often, there's that line of, well, you might have read an article or heard a podcast, or you option something, but then, the journey from optioning something to the screen is a massive creative journey. And so, you can do massive amount of world building. Often writers, definitely bring us ideas. A lot of it in television comes from writers bringing us ideas. Sometimes we're workshopping with them. We might find a book together. It comes in all sorts of ways.
And how much is the idea and how much is your faith in the person?
I think it's largely the person, but you need a good idea. You need an idea that can go all the way. So, and a good idea, you might want to question what that means. And the answer would be that obviously it has to hold all the needs of drama or comedy or whatever it is within it. But it's also got to have a market for it. We have to understand the marketplace. Who can we sell this to? Is it Netflix Australia or Netflix UK or the US? Is it a traditional broadcaster, a streamer? Often we get a story which might be a brilliant story. We had one recently which we had to let go of. I won't mention which it is. But it was a most fantastic book and story and hugely resonant for this moment. But it crossed over between countries too much. So there was just no there was no buyer for it, because the Australian buyers wouldn't buy it. It wasn't Aussie enough. The UK buyers wouldn't. The European buyers, the US, we couldn't work out whose interest was it to buy the show. So
does that make you sad?
Very sad, very sad. But the marketplace is constantly changing. The economic structure of the marketplace determines hugely what content gets made. I mean, people often forget about that, in a Marxist analysis, it's the economics that determine the economic, base determines the superstructure of shows.
I mean, that's right. And it's funny that, like, when you talk about creatives, you're reminding me that very few creatives are what the lay non-creative thinks a creative is, which is someone who sits alone in a room, gets struck by inspiration, and then paints their masterpiece of a painting or writes their novel or something. Like, most working creatives are assigned a job that someone else has come up with, and they have to do that job. Most writers, especially in our industry, in your industry, they're not coming up with the genesis of some idea that they then shepherd through to its fruition. I mean, occasionally you'll have a showrunner who comes up with a great idea and is still there at the finale. But very frequently, what it means to be a creative is to be given a task and say, all right, you have to punch up this script because episode 3 is not funny enough, and here's the bones of it. But we need the protagonist to get from this state to that state over the course of this episode, go, you've got 10 days.
Yeah. I mean, we have a tradition in Australia, more similar to the US than the UK, actually, of writers' rooms. So you might have a core writer who's come up with an idea, and then you build a room around them to be able to brainstorm and support. And sometimes, we have a writer's room going soon, which is 6 weeks. Enormous amount of time to build out the story over 8 hours of story. Television chews up the most extraordinary amount of story. And so a lot of those writers there, pretty much all of them except one, didn't come up with the idea, but their creativity is what we're calling on. And it is a delicate balance as a executive producer, the development producer, whoever is helping shepherding that process of not squashing the creativity. Our job is to bring it out and to create in a writer's room a condition where writers can explore, be vulnerable. There's a lot of crying that goes on in these rooms.
Mostly when you're beating the writers for being late.
Yes. Well, we're human beings and we respond, we resonate physically to things that feel real and true. And we're in a business of fabricating truth. Actors' jobs is to, perform, but in a way that feels entirely true. And a writer's job is to create characters and words that feel like it's coming from the inside out, not from the outside in. And I think we all know that when we watch a TV show or film, and it feels like we can see the mechanics there. We can see the plot forcing the characters to do things because we need a conclusion or a big moment here. And then we can also see ones that I think end up cutting through much more substantively, where it just seems to come naturally.
Yeah.
And you're really creating a world of characters who seem to just do shit.
How do you stave off cliche? Because I think that's sort of what you're talking about, isn't it? I mean, there are some... Look, I'm always baffled by how successful cliche can be. Like Baby Reindeer, I hope you didn't have anything to do with that because I'm about to insult it. But I was amazed at how successful that was. I mean, I pushed through about 3 or 4 episodes and I was like... I turned to my partner, I said... You give me a napkin or an envelope and I'll jot on the back of it within 5 minutes of each episode basically what's going to happen, the sort of rough beats. It might not be exactly right, but I know these characters. I don't know them from real life. I know them from other works of art. I know that it's based on a true story, but the way that it's being depicted is these are the same tics and mannerisms and character arcs that I've seen a million times. There's nothing new. Surprise me. Give me something authentic and...
There's
surprising.
a lot to say there. I mean, there are different moments in the industry where, again, it does, you can look at it through the economic lens and go, there was a big moment where streamers came in and every streamer we went to said, our mantra is to not be like linear broadcast television. So we want to be bold. We want to be totally different. Whatever is crazy, let's do. Because they had to differentiate themselves and not be the show that you could watch for free. So that created a big sort of creative explosion of trying to reinvent what television could be. We did a show called Top of the Lake at the early stages of that, which was, part of that sort of early stage, I guess, thinking outside the box of television. And then, there's been this proliferation of streamers. The market exploded. Huge numbers of production companies and writers spawned and everyone in the industry. And so many... streamers chasing eyeballs, but I think they realized that, they might have overchased because the business model didn't really make sense. And so there's been this big consolidation. And they're going back to basics and going, we need to do stuff that we know is going to work. And so you end up with shows being essentially the same as that other show, but with a twist.
Right.
And that's sort of where we are now with a lot of shows. It's and even with the streamers, we want the same, but with a little twist.
Yeah. And
finding...
I remember when you're reminding me that when I first got to New York, my first agent in New York, God bless him, he wanted me to pitch every idea that I had. Not script. This wasn't scripted entertainment. This was unscripted, right? So documentary shows or me being a sort of a Louis Theroux fly on the wall type character. But he wanted it always pitched as it's such and such meets such and such, or it's such and such but on a plane. The kind of snakes on a plane. Or Con Air. It's it's like Alcatraz, but it's at sea, or some stupid thing like that. And there is a lot of that. And I wonder if actually when networks and streamers say that they want something truly new, they're just saying that, and maybe they believe it and maybe they don't. But if you actually bring them something new, they're like, oh, it's a bit weird. And then you bring them something that is sort of the same but just slightly different. They're like, yes, this is fresh.
Well, particularly the real paradox is when you do a show, and Top of the Lake was an example of something that did break new ground.
Yes, it was Jane Campion's show set in New Zealand, looks beautiful, starring
Elizabeth Moss.
Elizabeth Moss, yeah.
And there was a second season set in Sydney and with Nicole Kidman. But people after a show like that, which was a bit of a groundbreaking moment, say, we want something fresh like Top of the Lake. But you can't do another Top of the Lake, then it's not fresh.
Right.
So you're sort of trapped in that sort of circular logic. Look, it depends on the moment. And that balance between the familiar, there's the familiar that the audience needs. They need to often, and again, depends what the show's aiming for, but a lot of the time you want audiences to be invited into something, to feel that they're coming into something familiar, but it's a way of doing it that they've never seen before. But then there's also, how do you sell a show to the commissioner? Because the commissioner's got a job and they need to make sure they don't lose their job.
The commissioner's job is to say no.
The commissioner's job is
to say no to anything that could in any way get them fired, which is a problem, in my experience, because commissioners are not creative enough necessarily. Maybe I'm being too cynical, but I find it very difficult to explain to someone a vision that may be risky, because their brain is always going through, and this is another way in which it may not work, and this is another way in which it may not work, and this is another way in which it may not work or may go wrong. Or how can I say no to this? And you have to take them something that is watertight. You can take it to the bank. Like, there's no way they can say no to it.
Yeah, I mean, look, the fact is 99% of things they pitch, they say no to because they've only got X slots. If you've got 5 slots a year, you are saying no to, hundreds of shows.
Things, yeah.
So most people will feel like their job's to say no. A lucky few feel like it's their job to say yes. And how do they choose that yes? It's a big bet they're putting. If you've got 5 slots, it's a massive bet. So you don't want to lose your job. And, the more you've been successful...
is it a huge bet? I mean, you go to them, you go Jane Campion, Elizabeth Moss, Nicole Kidman. I mean, that... Well, I feel like you can take that to the bank.
Well, that one, we did get away very easily. But, many other shows are a huge bet because, they're financing the large part of it. And they've only got 5, rolls of the dice here, or whatever metaphor we use, and
if it doesn't have huge stars,
and if it doesn't have huge stars, but even if it does, they've got a lot of other projects with huge stars. They need the huge stars, and they need a writer that they know is going to deliver, and they need a production company they know they can.
So
really
how do you get something up like Heartstopper, which isn't an obvious sell, apart from the fact that I suppose thematically it's in the zeitgeist because we're,
well, the budget's low. The lower the budget, the more room you've got to be a little bit more, risky.
Yeah.
And I think if the commissioner has had some big hits and they've got some confidence, they're probably afforded to, take some risk. And Heartstopper started off more in the kids, young person area of Netflix, and then moved to main part.
Right.
But it was.
You mean after it was made and released?
No, they're the sort of the group that originally.
Oh, okay.
Got involved in it. So the budget was super low, and that's the way you make it.
And if a commissioner has a bunch of wins under their belt and there's something with a low budget, they know that it can go south and it's not going to cost them their job because they can basically cross subsidize a few cheap experimental projects with the wins from the other things that were more dependable.
And then you look at the company and where's the company at in its cycle of growth or competition. Do they have more money than they know what to do with or nowhere near enough?
So just before we leave the concept of ideas versus execution, a friend of mine, David Plotz, who co-hosts the Slate Political Gabfest, who has been a CEO basically all his life, as well as a journalist, but like a CEO of media companies, says that like everyone thinks that ideas are important, but ideas, at least in business, are just a dime a dozen. Like ideas really don't matter. What matters is your ability to implement ideas over a long period of time. Yeah. And so we vastly index the importance of ideas and under-index the importance of boring logistical execution of ideas. Does that apply equally to the creative arts as it does to journalism?
Yeah, and I mean, the execution is about creative execution. Who is going to be able to both hold the craft of writing, if we're focusing on writing here, particularly in television, it's unbelievably complex craft of how to keep a story alive, every scene moving to the next scene, propelling. I've learned an enormous amount over the last few years in television. Very high level of craft. Mixed with...
What do you mean by craft?
Well, I mean, just the creativity of being able to write great dialogue and create great characters is not enough. To be able to create an hour of television that propels into another 7 hours where the strands of story, the inciting incident, the stakes and the threat are played through and the audience is held scene by scene by scene. You don't realize the spell you're in. I was watching... we've got a show called Slow Horses, which is in a number of seasons, and it's at the Emmy Awards. I saw that we were up against a show called The Gilded Age by Julian Fellows, who did Downton Abbey. So I wanted to check out the show, and the level of craft of that guy, how he's able to almost immediately, within like 5 minutes, create a world of characters who you just want to know what happens to them next.
Right.
What next? What next? What next?
Right.
So you need a writer who can deliver. Often we've got writers who may be less experienced. They've got germs of great ideas and creativity. So those are the two things you brought up. But they don't have the craft to be able to pull it off.
And is craft, when you think about craft, so some people will hear that and they'll think about, I once read a screenwriting book by Sid Field or Robert McKee where it said that on page, 13, you need to have an inciting incident, and then on page, 35, you have to have the dark night of the soul. Or I've read my Joseph Campbell and the hero myth, and we're taking the template that you see across all great stories and from Star Wars to this to that, and we're just going to rejig it and we're going to map our story onto that. I mean, that's a reductionistic way of putting it. I don't mean to demean or diminish that, because I do believe in story and the importance of story structure. But is that what you mean by craft, or do you mean character development as well?
No, I mean, I essentially mean that, but the sophisticated version of that, because obviously the idea is that you do it, but it's entirely hidden.
Yes.
That it's so
nonetheless,
natural,
by the end of the third scene, something has happened
that propels the fourth scene,
makes the
scene.
viewer, need to keep watching.
Exactly. And I think also we're in a moment now where broadcasters and streamers are really clear that in the episode 1, the proposition of the show needs to be set up. We're not in a world of Sopranos where, you can amble about with character for a couple of episodes and the motor of the story engine gets going later. You need to set up early. What's the challenge? And what's the quest?
Yeah. What's the call to action?
What's the call to action?
Yeah.
And then it's like, then we're away.
Yeah.
So there's a massive amount of craft of knowing how that works. But you can bring in people, story producers and development producers who understand that and can help support writers. No one writer can do everything. But, at the core of it, let's just be clear that it is about creativity. And that's what I'm excited to explore in the Sandbox, is because all the craft in the world and the best idea in the world is meaningless without creating an infrastructure whereby creativity can flourish.
And so what is creativity on a workaday basis? Because creativity, this is another thing, I'll make the analogy to the point that I just made about ideas that I'm stealing from David Plotz about the sort of overrating of ideas. Everyone has walked along the street and been struck by a great creative insight of some kind, right? We all have those, but generating a script or sitting down in front of the blinking cursor of a blank page of of a computer and spending 4 hours there, even when the well is dry and you're feeling frustrated, and not going off and doing the dishes or cleaning the kitchen instead. How much is perspiration and how much is inspiration?
Yeah, and what does perspiration look like?
And where is the creativity in the perspiration? Because, at the risk of restating the question about ideas versus hard work, it's like...
No, I understand what you're asking. I
mean, it also relates... Just to throw another thing in there, it also relates to the idea of write what you know, right? I mean, some of the best things I've written have been the least creative things because I've just been psychologically transcribing scenarios that I was already in. I mean, you don't have to make up out of whole cloth what humans are like. You've met humans.
Yeah.
Just imagine it's going to smell more real if you go, well, hang on a second, how would so and so who I once met at that party actually respond if I said X?
Well,
not how would the creative character who I've invented respond, because that might be a cliche. I might be leaning on a cliche.
Could we park the question around writing what we know versus imagination?
Yeah.
Because that's a great question, and let's come back to that.
Yeah.
But the question on perspiration and inspiration, perspiration looks like different things to different writers. You have to understand each writer has their own process, and you have to understand how to bring out the best creative instincts in each writer. But there are different structures as well. For example, when I was talking to Jane Campion, about her process, part of her process is literally, as you said, to stare at the page with her pen for 4 hours and not writing a single thing.
Right.
Because she's trying to wait for her subconscious to, throw her something. And so is that perspiration or inspiration? You're actually committing to a practice, a very rigorous, and it's the hardest thing to do. It's much easier to go into a writer's room and go, hey, my friends, let's get some chocolates in here and some, drink, and we're going to chat about the third act turning point in episode 5. You've got a lot of energy there. But to sit there with no one else by yourself, just waiting, hour after hour after hour, that's really hard. So I think that's a sort of the nexus of perspiration and inspiration. But there are other, in England, the general process of writing television, it's quite solitary. One writer will generally write it, and they will write normally at 6 hours, has been their sort of traditional BBC show in terms of like a limited series. And again, it comes down to that one writer, and the job of the production company, the development producer, the executive producer, is to support them and be a sounding board, to challenge them, to encourage them, and to help unlock the best version of their voice.
And at what point would that entity enter the picture? Suppose that they are a reasonable novice, like they might have done a few things, but they're not someone who a network or a production company is going to bank on yet necessarily. How much do they have to produce in the solitude of their own room before someone's going to buy?
Well, traditionally they'll come to a production company, someone senior enough, with a pitch, an idea. And if we took it on, then we'd work on the script with them, maybe go to a broadcaster early, maybe go later. If they're a novice, no one's backing novices in television. It's quite different to film, interestingly. Occasionally a novice is backed. You'd certainly have to write a script the first episode or two and prove that you can do it. But in television, there's a massive risk taken on the writer because the show is commissioned before all the scripts are written.
Yeah, right.
And that's not like a film. A film is financed when you've got a script. So it means that totally new writer in film could come along, write a genius script, and it could get made. It's not likely to be made.
I've actually just been I'm halfway through rewatching The Sixth Sense for the first time since it came out 25 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, which is an example of that. It's an incredible feat. It's such a shame that Shyamalan hasn't been able to match that consistently, because I don't think he's done great work since, but on the whole, a few notable exceptions. But that's just an amazing script and so well executed and so well done.
Execute it,
and he just wrote it. He just pulled it out of his ass.
Yeah.
Just had the idea and made it work.
And then it sits on the page. So what's the risk that a financier, distributor, studio is taking to make that? Zero, because it's written.
Right.
But if you go with episode 1 to binge here, and you say we want to do this, you might develop another episode or 2, but they have to commission the show,
right,
knowing that the writer, together with the production house, is going to be able to deliver. So
and how important is having a name? So, I don't know what order Shyamalan got Bruce Willis in, but presumably once that's attached, then that becomes a much easier sell. I know there were stories about The King's Speech, which was a film that you produced, about getting Geoffrey Rush on board. Did you leave, or did someone leave the script at his doorstep because
that was
you couldn't get through to his agent? To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing, if it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations Substack.